Rev up your engines!
Otto says, Scotty, I got a 2014 Hyundai Santa Fe Sport. The oil cap says 0520, but I noticed they put 0530. I'm in Toronto. What do you recommend? The car was made in the USA. I recommend the oil that it was designed for. They're just putting in the 5W30 because it's a cheaper oil. And you live in a colder climate in the winter. You want lighter oil in the winter. When I was a young mechanic, really early, most people use straight oil, like straight 30 weight oil. And in the summer, they might have used a heavier 40 weight oil because it was hot and it flowed. But in the winter, they'd go back to the lower weight 30 weight oil. I mean, some guys like in Saudi Arabia used to say, well, it's hot here all the time, so we need a little bit better oil. Use what the engineers designed the car for. That's what they were designed for. The flow of the oil. They're all overhead cam engines, and when you start the car, the overhead cams are dry, and the oil pump's got to pump it up. It's going to pump a lighter oil up faster and have less wear. Something like 90% of the wear of your engine is on startups, and you don't want to increase that wear by having an oil that's too heavy and it takes too long to get up there. Brandon St. Clair says, when you replace brake pads, should you always replace or resurface the rotors? All right, I don't, unless there's a problem. If you have a car, and your brake pads are worn, you go down the highway, you're going 60, and you hit the brakes hard, and the steering wheel goes straight and it doesn't wobble, they're not warped. I see no reason to waste money replacing the rotors. Now, turning rotors, modern rotors, I never, ever turn modern rotors. They make them thinner and thinner and thinner. They made a lot thicker when I was young, now they're a lot thinner. All that energy going down the road, kinetic energy, turns into heat when you slam on the brakes. If your brake rotors have warped, you don't want to turn them because the brand new ones warped from the heat. If you turn them, turning just moves the metal till they're flat again. So there's even less metal, and they will warp the second time even faster. I've seen fools turn rotors on a car, 6 months later they're warped and they're shaking again. If it's not shaking, I leave them alone. But if you're a fanatic, go ahead and change them, but change the rotors. Don't turn them on a lathe, just replace. Boo Boo says, I got a 2013 Hyundai Azera that had a rebuilt engine, drives but burns oil quickly. What should I do? Well, I would personally strangle the idiot that rebuilt it because obviously they didn't rebuild it right. Now, what I'm assuming, and I've seen this a whole bunch of times, Hyundai had recalls where they had to rebuild a bunch of engines, and that year is one of the years that they had to recall, right? So it was supposedly rebuilt at a Hyundai dealer. They don't do it right. I had one customer have it done, and then 9 months later, the engine blew up. And they didn't cover that. They said, well, we already fixed the recall. Too bad that it blew up. Because the guy obviously didn't put it back together right. There aren't that many guys that rebuild engines anymore. Back in the day, people did it all the time. Engines only lasted so long, and they'd rebuild them. But today, if you change the oil and they're built right, they last a really long time. And there's very few guys out there who actually do a good job rebuilding engines. That said, these clowns at Hyundai and Kia, basically it's the same company now, they own each other, they had to recall, and they had to do thousands and thousands of them over, and I'm sure they did a lousy job on them all. And if it was one of yours that was done there, I'm sure they did a lousy job. It's burning oil. A rebuilt engine should not burn oil. But oil's cheap. Just keep adding oil, and there's nothing you're going to do. Go complain to them. They'll probably tell you to take off. Like, oh, well, we already did the recall. Too bad. You don't want to buy a crappy car. So I tell people, don't chance it with these companies like Hyundai, Kia. Sometimes they last, sometimes they don't, but their overall quality is... I see Toyotas with 500,000 miles that barely burn any oil, and they've never been touched. Never seen a Kia or a Hyundai do that. Ever. No Go says, Scotty, should I buy an existing Toyota Sequoia V8 or wait until the new V6 twin-turbo Sequoia? Me, I'd go for the V8. I am not a twin-turbo fan. Toyota makes great vehicles. I'm not arguing that. But those V8 engines in those Tundras and Sequoias can last forever. Going to a V6, I think, is a mistake. I've seen many Tundras with 500,000. The engines have never been touched, and they still run perfectly fine. I have never seen a twin-turbo V6 of any company ever go that far without the turbos being replaced, the engines being rebuilt. No. I'm not a fan of that stuff. It's great, interesting technology. It puts out power, but man, it doesn't last as long. And if you're the type of person who wants one to last long, get the V8. Don't get the twin turbo. But if you're the type of guy that keeps your cars 100,000 miles, get whatever you want, because they'll last that anyway. You know, but I'm talking about people who are in it for the long haul. Depends on what you're in it for. Yes, sir, says Scotty, what can I do to prevent my 2010 Lexus IS 250 from carboning up? Change the oil regularly. The Lexuses really do not have a carboning up problem. Now, Volkswagen, take a Volkswagen Jetta or something with a GDI, turbos on it, they carbon up all the time. They get real thick carbon on them, sometimes over an inch thick, really thick. But those don't really have that problem. Just change your oil regularly and take care of it. Shouldn't have any problems at all with it carboning up. It's the Volkswagens and other cars that carbon up. Those really don't have a problem carboning up if you change the oil regularly. Neil Monte says, Scotty, I know you're not a fan of Nissan and Hyundai, but between the 2013 Nissan Sentra and the 2013 Hyundai Elantra, which which one would you choose? On that, I'd get the Elantras way over that Nissan. Those Sentras were a pile of crap. Now, originally, they were pretty good cars that could last a long time, but oh man, their transmissions, their CVT transmissions are garbage. With that, I would go with the Hyundai, because I've had people with those Elantras. I had a customer that had one. He had 150,000 miles. Now, he was a sales rep, so it was all highway mileage, which doesn't wear like stop and go city driving, but at least it was still going okay. The Sentras, no, they're terrible cars nowadays. I would go the Hyundai with that. Of course, depending on the shape of the car, you got to test it out. You don't buy them sight unseen, but I would definitely point towards that one first. I would never buy the Sentra, regardless of what condition it was in now, unless it had like 20,000 miles and it was dirt cheap. Richard Henry says, Scotty, can a bad rear engine mount cause shaking on the steering? Yeah, if it's bad enough, the whole thing starts shaking around. Anything shakes, you're going to feel it in the steering wheel because the car's shaking. You don't want a bad motor mount. Now, assuming that's the problem, yes, it can do it. Now, if you want to check it yourself, it's pretty simple to do. Just get a jack and a piece of board, a little 2x4, right? Stick it under the oil pan, slowly jack it up. Have somebody else jack it up, and you watch the engine. If you see the engine lifts up and the body doesn't follow, look at the mount and you'll see that it's all separated and it is actually broken. And if you see it physically broken, yes, replace the obvious things first. Anytime you repair something, always do the obvious first. Don't do some, oh, well, let's try that. No, when you see something's broken, fix that first because it's obvious. And a lot of times down the line, it'll fix a bunch of other problems, and you got to fix it anyway. So always fix what you can see. That's why the hardest thing to fix on most cars is electrical problems, because we can't see electricity, so it's a lot trickier to figure them out. Kimberly Cersei says, 2012 Toyota Corolla was rebuilt, 92,000. Is it a good buy? It's 6,800. If you meant the engine was rebuilt, I would not buy the car, because those engines can go hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of miles. And if it had to be rebuilt, it would mean the person did not maintain the car, so I wouldn't buy it at all. But on the other hand, if you mean it has a rebuilt title, I am not a fan of buying cars with rebuilt titles. It means it was told by insurance company and blah. Unless, as a guy brought me a car a few weeks ago. He bought a rebuilt car, but he bought it from a guy. It's all he sells. He buys cars that are totaled, fixes them, and sells them. Honest guy, ran a big body shop. And he showed you the pictures before and after. He said, here's how this car was smashed up. And you see the right front's all smashed up. And then you look at it now and it's all fixed. If he's honest and he's doing that, he can make money, because there's so much profit in body shop stuff that even though they might say that's $10,000 of damage will total the car. If a guy runs a body shop, he might be able to fix a thing for a couple of grand. So he's got $8,000 wiggle room to make a profit. So in that case, that's not bad. But as a general practice, don't buy a rebuilt title. It was totaled by insurance company for probably a pretty good reason. Dominic Stair says, my 2015 Honda Civic SI is made in Canada. Is it just as good as in Japan? Generally, about as good. Canadians are very good at building cars. I've had 2 Canadian cars in my life. I've had a Ford Maverick that was made in Oakville, Ontario, and I still have my wife's Matrix that was made in Cambridge, Ontario. Excellent vehicles. But realize one thing. It's still the Honda Japanese engines, transmissions, all that stuff in them. They're not building the engines there. They're coming from Japan. So it's more or less assembly points where they're putting the stuff together. And Canadians are pretty good at building cars. Drove the heck out of that Maverick. Bought it for $550, drove it for years and years in the Matrix. Who knows, I might have it 50 years from now. If they still sell gasoline, it'll probably still be running. And that was made in Cambridge, Ontario. So yeah, they make them good there. Conroe says, Scotty, do I have to do valve adjustment on my 2010 Honda Civic? There's no weird noises yet. It's a good idea to do them at least like once every 70, 80,000 miles. Not all that often, right? But it is a good idea, because Honda, as I said numerous times, they're not like other cars. They don't have hydraulic lifters in them. You have to adjust them. They're little threaded rods with bolts. You got to loosen them and then adjust them and do all of them. It's kind of a pain in the butt. 70, 80,000 miles, do it, and it'll last longer and run better. Robson Braga says, Scotty, I'm going to travel for a month. How do I avoid my battery from discharging? Well, if you want, just take the battery terminal off. Either one, and it won't be connected. It won't get discharged. Guys that are fanatics, they will use these battery savers. You can desulfate batteries, and how you can make them last a long time by plugging them into one of these fancy chargers that automatically exercises the battery, so that even though you're not using it for a month, it acts like it's discharging it like you would when you start the car, and then it recharges it, and it makes it last longer. And those things are anywhere from $50 to $80. If you want, you might get one of those, plug it in if you got a garage, and just leave it there. They don't use much power, because it's mainly charged up the whole time anyways. They use nickels worth of power or something, and they do work quite well. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.